Hello and welcome to the GoodPractice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Garner and this is episode 102, What is xAPI anyway? For over a decade, SCORM has been the industry standard for e-learning, allowing your course to speak to my LMS without us having to discuss compatibility. But now there's a new-ish kid on the block, or is it a solution that no one asked for? I'm joined as usual by regular contributor Owen Ferguson. Hello Owen.
Hi Ross.
From Watershed we have Andrew Downs. Hello Andrew.
Hello.
And from HT2 Labs we have Ben Betts. Hello Ben.
Hello.
I'm going to throw my first question to the floor and hopefully we can together come up with an answer. What is xAPI? I'm conscious it sounds quite technical.
So I'll jump into an answer there. It's a question that I get asked on a weekly basis almost. So the answer I've kind of refined is that xAPI is this technical specification that makes it easier to connect learning technology products. So you can think of it a little bit like USB. So if you go into PC World or wherever, you buy something to connect your computer, you know that if it supports USB, you're going to be able to plug it in your computer, it's just going to work. xAPI is the same for learning technologies. So the idea is if a technology supports xAPI, you're going to be able to plug it in and connect it much more easily. So it makes it easier, makes it faster to connect learning technology products together.
Do you find that answer lands well with the people that you speak to?
Sometimes. I've got a round of applause recently, so I'm quite happy with that one.
We set a far higher bar here.
I mean, Andrew's right. I mean, I think it's a good analogy and one that people can sink their teeth into a little bit. I talk about the xAPI itself as being a way in which we can talk about our experiences using data. And we get challenges back from time to time, like, well, if it's that, then why isn't it an experience record store instead of a learning record store that I have here? Well, you have Andrew's boss to thank for that one. I think Mike takes ownership of learning record stores, but that seems to trigger a few conversations about it. But people do get somewhat lost in what xAPI itself as a specification allows us to do, and some of the affordances that we might get on the other side of having collected data and done it in a standard interoperable way. And that can get confusing because the sorts of things that vendors like myself and probably Andrew, although I don't want to put words in your mouth, Andrew would talk about, can be quite sexy, data impact type things and things like that. That these are things that are the result of having used a standard way of talking about our experiences rather than something that xAPI itself says how to do.
Yeah, and I think there might be something else as well, because there have been standards before in the learning tech space. But the thing about xAPI is that it's a modern specification. It's well constructed. It's friendly for developers who aren't necessarily completely au fait with the learning technology sector specifically. So I mean, I think I had mentioned this to Andrew a number of years ago, but when I showed our developers the xAPI specification, it was the first time that they had looked at something that could come from learning tech. So I'm thinking of SCORM, or there's the kind of single sign-on thing between learning technology interoperability.
LTI.
Yeah, LTI. So xAPI is the first time they looked at it and said, that's really nice, we could work with that. So there's something about it supplanting some, and I don't want to denigrate SCORM too much because it's just old. That's the issue with it. xAPI appears to be simpler, more developer friendly piece that, as you say, Ben, allows you to do a lot more interesting things because it's broader than just learning.
But SCORM, yes, it's old, but I think in the vast majority of contexts, it does do the job. So most of the organisations that we speak to want to know if people have completed the resource or what score they've got. And beyond that, I think maybe it's a lack of imagination or a lack of knowing what's possible, but there's not much demand for that I've seen, really.
So there's kind of two different answers I'd give to that, depending on what mood I'm in on a given day. So I'll give you both answers for this podcast. The one answer is that, yes, you're right, SCORM does a good job of what it does in terms of packaged content, upload to an LMS, tracks completion, tracks scores, it does that pretty well. But then xAPI is much broader, so you can get either more detailed data, maybe down to how people are answering questions, or you can then begin to track other types of learning experiences, whether that's games or video, accessing resources, what people are searching for in a platform, that sort of thing. So that's one answer. My other answer, though, is taking myself back to when I used to work for a college, and I was actually the guy working with SCORM, responsible for making these packages work with the LMS. And actually, SCORM doesn't always work that well.
I'll say.
If you've ever had problems with pop-up blockers, or with frames not working on mobile phones, there are a lot of problems with SCORM, and some of those are issues that using xAPI can just knock out the window and make no longer relevant.
Yeah, and that's goes back to what Owen said, is about being modern standard. You're going back to 1997 when we're talking about building SCORM 1.2 sort of content as it came out. So stuff's moved on in 20 years. I guess if we sit there and say that SCORM data, or knowing whether somebody's completed or got a pass mark in something, is good enough for our purposes, I think we're really denigrating the role of learning and development and talent building in the organisation. We're doing ourselves a massive disservice here, which will eventually see the end of us, because every other part of the business is moving towards making more data-driven decisions. And if we've only got this sort of broad outcome data that we're just kind of happy with and leave it at that, we're really not moving into that world. We had a chap in from Gloucester Rugby Club a few weeks ago to talk about how they use data as part of their training. And it's quite interesting talking to professional sports people here, because these guys have been deep into data and what it means to them. And there's a couple of things that really struck me. One was sort of the level at which they train at, and the pass rate of exercises. So at Gloucester Rugby, Premier League rugby club here in the UK, so a good standard of rugby, professional rugby. If in a training exercise the pass rate is higher than 70%, then they'll scrap the training exercise, because the training exercise should be preparing people for the intensity of performing. And so if we have a training exercise that's too simple, then they'll get rid of it. It's not an effective training exercise for what it comes into. And that's very basic data-driven decisions. And going more advanced, they also are tracking the performance of players. So there was one stat that always sticks in my mind. If you're a rugby aficionado, this will mean something. If you're not, then it'll mean very little. But what we find is they talk about the impact of a tackle on a rugby player. So when a rugby player is in a game, they feel the impact of what's meant to be the equivalent of 8 to 10 car crashes during the course of a game as they go into tackles. But they're timing how quickly these guys get back to their feet. So if you look on the back of their jerseys at any point, they've got a little IoT tracker in the back of their sweater. The sweater, they don't wear sweaters. Jersey, whatever the heck it is. I'm showing myself up here. In their top, they've got a thing what puts out data. And the idea is that if you're not back on your feet and ready to hit the next tackle within 3 seconds, then you're failing to meet the benchmark that they require. And you're going to need to go into some sort of remedial training or some sort of exercises to get you back on your feet. So these guys got to have a car crash and be ready for the next car crash within 3 seconds. And this is the standard they've established as a benchmark to say that if we meet this benchmark, we believe we will win more than we lose. And this is the sort of data-driven decision that we've got nothing out of the sort of SCORM world or any of the 20 years of data that we've been collecting here to say, really, how somebody getting to this sort of grade actually impacts on the organisation. So long answer to the SCORM question and getting on the SCORM train. To go back to Andrew's point, it's not necessarily always a bad thing. I think you end up in a bit of an evolution type question where we all imagine that everything points towards man as being the ultimate answer. But, SCORM may have a place that may be on a different branch of the evolution tree when it comes to what we do. And that may be where it gets to. But it also isn't great. And it gives us nothing in terms of the real data-driven decision-making that the rest of the business is getting involved in.
I guess so the difference there is that so with SCORM, you have to go to the LMS and take a SCORM course there. You have to go somewhere external to it. Whereas with the xAPI or your rugby example, the thing that you're doing generates the data where you already are. You don't need to think about going somewhere to generate that data. It's happening in the background. Andrew, you were going to come in there.
Yeah, just going back to Ben's point about getting the data that you need to make those data-driven decisions. Really interesting to think about examples, obviously, of what Ben's clients are doing. And just thinking about our own clients, the kinds of insights that they're getting, actually hardly any of them are insights that they would have got with SCORM data. So I think of one client that's looking at which days of the week people are not attending training. You wouldn't get that from SCORM. Another client is looking at what are the most popular things people are searching for. You wouldn't get that from SCORM. We had another client who just recently on a webinar, they mentioned that they were able to identify for a particular course that everybody was getting a particular question wrong, and that identified a gap in the training. That's another bit of data that you'd be unlikely to get from a SCORM course. So a lot of these insights it requires more data than you would get with SCORM.
Yeah, I think that's because SCORM defined both how you capture the data, but also what it was that you capture. Whereas xAPI is all about how you capture the data, but actually it's got a huge flexibility in terms of what it is that you're capturing. It standardizes the format of the data, but it doesn't say exactly what it is, and so that allows you to plug it into other business systems.
I'm still. I don't want to be like the difficult child here, but.
Then don't. You go along with us.
Why change the...
I think even when as soon as you start talking about xAPI, you start talking about you could do this or you could do that. It's very rarely couched in terms of a real world problem that's going to be solved in the same way as so SCORM, we have to know that people have completed our courses for whatever compliance reason that we have. And SCORM's a good solution to that. I'm still struggling to work out what the problem is that xAPI solves.
Well, it's interesting you say that. So towards maturity, you're also putting out a data survey in the next few weeks where they've surveyed 150 organisations. And one of the things that they're saying is that course completions appears to have no correlation with the impact of business performance in those people that they've sort of surveyed.
We already knew that.
So you're sitting there saying it's solving a problem that we have, but it's not. We're solving a problem of our own devising. In that sort of routine, in that I don't want to have to deploy a learning management system all the time. So I mean, there is something to that, don't get me wrong. There are other things that there's sort of more fundamental systemic things that I think xAPI can solve. So I mean, one of the things is how can I collect normalized, standardized data from many different places. If you look at the trends of 70-20-10, informal, formal, everything else that comes out like that, there is a change in the landscape here to say that we have more tools, more diverse tools. So being able to report in a standard way is genuinely a problem for people. Again, that same towards maturity benchmark says 51% of people struggle to have data in a single format. How can you make sure that the data you collect today is useful tomorrow? A lot of the learning management systems that people rely on for their data and reporting have proprietary schemas, proprietary ways of talking about their reports and things like that. So if we want to make sure that we don't get locked in to a solution that we find it very difficult to migrate away from, and this is a typical learning management system type problem, then you need to adopt a more standard way of doing things. And that goes to, how can I extract my data? How can I own my data? How can I fulfill data access requests as a result of GDPR? All of these things lead towards an inevitable cutting of costs that can come in when you have a single source of data in a standard format. And I guess what Andrew and I would probably lobby for is that in our area of business, the xAPI is the most prominent and the most well-defined and developed standardization, and standard's a tricky word in this area, but it's the most well-developed spec we have to do all of those things that you'd get as a result of more standard ways of collecting data.
I'd go back to my USB example. Sometimes I speak to people who want to do xAPI, and then you'll talk to them, well, what do you want to do with xAPI? And they don't necessarily know. And it's a little bit like, I'm going to use PC World as my example. You go into PC World, sales guy comes up to you, how can I help? And you say, I want to do something with USB. I want to get something I can connect to my computer with USB. You wouldn't do that. You go in, you look for a mouse, a printer, a memory stick. It's not about the standard. And so I would say, don't look to do xAPI. Look to collect data that's going to allow you to make data-driven decisions about your learning. Maybe look to collect data about what a learner is doing across different systems. And xAPI might be part of the answer, and probably will be part of the answer for those things. But xAPI in itself isn't the goal.
All right. So how are you using xAPI then? What are some of the things that you've achieved with it?
So, the main thing is making it easier to connect technologies. So at Watershed, we have this learning analytics platform, provides reporting and analytics. So our customers can then use Watershed to report on what learners are doing across their ecosystem, to look at what's effective, what's not effective, and then to use that to make those data-driven decisions. So xAPI for us makes it easier and faster to connect data sources. So if a product that we're connecting to already supports xAPI, we can get that connection set up really quickly, sometimes as fast as 15 minutes. A lot of the time, customers also have products that don't support xAPI, and in those cases, we still end up connecting the data, but it's a much longer, sometimes it can take a month or two, or sometimes even longer to get that connection in place. So it's just so much faster, so much easier to get that data connected with xAPI.
And is that just learning products, or is it stuff like for example, Salesforce? Could you have a connection between the number of sales someone's making and the training that they've been on?
Yeah, so generally non-learning products don't generally implement xAPI, so we do end up using another approach. But even in those scenarios, xAPI does help because we translate the data into xAPI. So we have got data out of Salesforce before, either by getting a CSV dump, or there's a product called xAPI that does integrations that we've used to connect to Salesforce as well. And having that data in that standard xAPI format, even if it hasn't originated in xAPI, it makes it easier to configure and build reports around that data as well. So it's not just learning products. And in fact, one product that's not a learning product that does have excellent xAPI support is Survey Gizmo. So there are some products outside the learning space that have adopted xAPI.
Because that feels like the difficult bit. Proving the impact of learning is notoriously difficult. Proving it within a series of learning platforms, even more so, because they tend not to historically track things that actually suggest that performance has improved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to get that data. And what I'll say on that as well is don't jump straight to the business impact either. Sometimes when people start to look at this, they go straight from, did someone do the learning? Did it increase the overall profitability of the business as a whole? And you can't make that kind of leap. There's just too much in between.
Why not?
Because there's so many other factors involved. There's just so much else that can have that.
I'm now playing the role. I've gone from a belligerent child to the chief financial officer.
Careful now. Because the trouble is, both myself and Andrew are representative vendors in the space. So the answer is yes, of course, Ross, we can do that. That's fine. If you want us to track the effect on your share price, I'll do that next. So that's not a big deal. There's lots of examples that you get here. So my company, HG2 Labs, has a competitive product to Watershed called Learning Locker. And so I agree with everything Andrew said in terms of the sort of what we do on a day-to-day basis will look very similar. The sorts of measures that people are getting to in terms of going beyond just reporting, although let me say, to be honest with you, there's a lot to be had out of that just reporting phase, because we get a lot of pain points where people say, I just want to know whether X has done Y, or whether this person is qualified to do this position, or whatever. So there's a lot to be covered when you start bringing these products together, because increasingly people have these ecosystems of tools, and bringing that data into a single point solves significant pain problems and can also save a lot of time. A lot of administrative time is taken up on crunching spreadsheets and doing things like that. So there is low-hanging fruit in that sort of routine. Going beyond that, you see examples where we're able to show impact of a specific sales training program on specific aspects of sales in certain stores. We've been able to show that on a couple of occasions. Not everything leads back to something like retail sales, where the ROI is a little bit more obvious. Other times you have to look outside that box. For example, we have other people who are quite focused on reducing time to competency. So if you can imagine that day one, you're paying somebody the same wage as you are in day 90, but if they're not ready for the workplace in that time, then there's a certain premium you're paying for that person to be in your organization and not ready yet. if you're able to understand the journey that people go on in order to become ready in their role, and then you're able to make data-driven decisions about how you might tweak that to bring it down, then you start to see real impacts in terms of the business bottom line again. We have examples of folks who onboard huge amounts of seasonal staff, for example, and just taking 15 minutes out of them being ready to go and do something can be a significant cost saving, millions and millions.
Times 1,000 staff.
And you don't just have to look at that. You can look at retention, you can look at voluntary resignations, you can look at health and safety incidents, compliance incidents. I had a nice example of a defense contractor who started tracking not just their sort of more micro nuggets of learning, but also how many times rework was being done in the organization. So how many times somebody fills out a form and it gets sent back because it's wrong. That rework is a big operational overhead. And it's also a risk because we know from other data that inspection generally doesn't work very well in that sort of level. So once stuff starts getting sent back, stuff inevitably gets missed. And so that's actually a risk KPI you're playing in there. You're not thinking about how many people have completed the compliance training. You think about potentially delivering a KPI that says, we think the business is slightly riskier today than it was yesterday because we're seeing this amount of rework, this lack of engagement with these videos, and this compliance training's out of step or whatever. You're building towards a more holistic measure. And to your earlier point, Ross, how does this, we want to prove that this changes our business in some material way. There are so many variables that it is difficult to do it, but you can build a portfolio of evidence that suggests that your intervention may have had some impact in a more narrow area of the business.
Yeah, I might throw this to Owen because I'm interested in his views on the. If we talk about xAPI as a way of connecting multiple different platforms, one of the things that we hear an awful lot is that we should be consolidating all of our learning materials onto one platform, and that seems like a different approach to having the USBs connect them all. Owen, I know that you have thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've discussed this before, so we had conversations with Adam Harwood from ASOS back in episode 90-something, 80-something. We talked about...
I'll look it up while you answer.
So I think there are a couple of things that make that approach much more attractive. One is the xAPI standard, the ability to have data that you can tie back to individuals, and you can analyse at a much greater degree of granularity than you could before. And having that standard there and having lots of different applications adhering to that standard is incredibly attractive way of tying that together. And the flip side is the growing prevalence of single sign-on. As federated identity management, as a way of someone's identity is being carried through an application and can therefore then be stored in a data source like a learning record store through xAPI, and allow you to tie back people's actions across a range of different systems and identify trends. The whole benefit of capturing a lot more data at a greater degree of granularity is that you can interrogate that data and identify trends that may or may not impact on performance. That's what you want to find out, and the fact that you're capturing it means that you can go back and look at historical data to find out if you're... Quite often we have hunches. We think people who engage more in such and such a system might perform better. Well, let's find that out. Let's identify people who have engaged with that system more often and go and compare their activity against their actual performance data. How are they doing? How are they rated? And because you've got their identity through that single sign-on piece, it makes it much easier to do.
We have got a problem here, Owen, because that towards maturity data pulse I mentioned earlier, one of the parts that it's come out that I had to write down because I was like, you see, this is a demonstration of the issue I've got here, is that they found that 17% of their respondents were using a learning record store in some way. So they were tracking that level of granular data. 32% were using anecdotes. So, we have twice as many people using anecdotes as we do having that. Now, it's one thing to use an anecdote or to form the basis of a hypothesis that you can then go and investigate. But it kind of feels like probably more people. Well, it's no surprise that to me right now that double the amount of people notionally in our industry are using the water cooler chat as the basis of their decision making as they are actual evidence. By the way, Google Analytics was at 13% on that scale. So, you read into that what you will.
Yeah.
So that is, I have given you a hard time and you've all been very good sports about my badgering, but this is the reason for it, is that there does seem to be a lack of demand for data, and I think xAPI is a great thing. And so I want to try and pose some of those questions that are the reasons that you don't see that massive widespread adoption. And people are freaked out by data. They don't see the point. They've got their SCORM tracking and that seems fine. So I appreciate you being such good sports about all this.
Yeah, but this is part of the profession growing up, or learning and development turning into a profession. We need to be able to start finding out whether the things that we are doing actually work or not, and actually, finding out that some of the things that we've been doing haven't worked or don't work, is all to the good. We shouldn't be shying away from it. Other professions, certainly, there are different degrees of how well other professions do this, but certainly it's the
surgeons and pilots.
Yeah, surgeons and pilots is the classic example, isn't it? Medical science and
rugby players,
and professional sports. Absolutely, it's.
Yeah.
I am amazed sometimes that I've mentioned it before, but I go into the site 538. There's this incredibly detailed analysis of the performance of a particular player. I read an article the other day about a basketball. They did an analysis of why a basketball player lost his shoes so often while he was playing. It was unbelievably detailed. The circumstances that he lost them, the frequency that he lost them, how he personally performed immediately after and immediately before he lost his shoe. And I was looking at it and thinking, that's absolutely incredible. Imagine if you had that kind of analysis about people's performance at work, how much, the extent to which you could actually genuinely improve your own performance. And it's, standards like xAPI, learning record stores, be able to analyze that data gives you, I think there's huge potential there, should we decide to grasp the nettle.
Okay, so we're short on time, so what I might do rather than talk about what we can do with xAPI is send our listeners to your websites, if that's okay, guys. Andrew, do you want to do a little plug for your own, and then I'll go to Ben if that's okay?
Yeah, so a good place to start is client stories. So if you go to the Watershed website, which is watershedlrs.com, you can see there's a resources section, and in there are client stories. So I recommend going there, see what other people are doing with xAPI to make a difference in their organisations, and get inspired, and then come and talk to us.
Or talk to Ben.
Or
Ben?
Yeah. Or go to ht2labs.com and look under resources. It's like we hired the same designer, and in there you'll find a bunch of things. One, you'll find access to a couple of free, massive open online courses. So we have one at the moment about understanding impact using xAPI that you can sign up to and join in with videos. It's reasonably technical, but it's about how you can start to utilize some of that data, and it has some good client stories in amongst the mix. We also have a good 44-page guide, the Learning Technology Manager's Guide to xAPI that you can download for free. So everything under resources on ht2labs.com available for free.
Lovely. And the podcast that Owen was referencing earlier on, the ecosystem one, was episode 92. I'll put links to all of these into the show notes. Now let's move on to our regular feature, What I Learned This Week, where we reveal something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, would you like to go first?
Oh, of course. So I read about a piece of research into Einstein's general theory of relativity recently, looking at it from an interesting perspective. So one of the core, I know I could listeners won't be able to see this.
Literally every time, Owen, every time I come on this podcast, I have did you know that elephants walk funnily? And you're like, well, when I'm reading my normal thing about Einstein, I'm like, your life is so much better than mine. Continue.
I was just thinking this is going to be a tough edit.
I'm just a total nerd. I've got nothing. There is no fun in my life. It is just all physics and other data stuff. So one of the core concepts of relativity is that mass bends the curvature. Well, it bends space-time, and that a large enough mass will bend space-time so much that you can detect, or with sufficiently accurate equipment, you can detect the extent to which light has bent on its trajectory. So in this experiment, they measured the extent to which light from a galaxy that was 10 billion light years away was bent by a galaxy a mere 500 million light years away, and how accurately Einstein's theory of relativity predicted that change. And the thing that kind of caught my attention was, first of all, they're still checking relativity. It's been around for 107 years and has been tested time and time again. But I thought it was a lovely example of how the physical sciences don't just stop once they've checked once or twice. They continually check it, and they continually check it in different edge cases. And that's what science is about. And I think that there's, when I look at some of the papers in social science, I think there's a degree of rigour there that could be adopted. Rather than just looking at a single study, you should be checking these results a lot more frequently. So yeah, that was my nerdy paper of the week.
I liked it actually, but I'm a nerd too. Andrew, do you want to go next?
Yes, what I learned this week was slightly more practical. So I went camping. I went camping this weekend in the lovely, beautiful sunshine that we had. But last time I went camping, which was the Easter holidays, it was a little bit more rainy. I don't know if anyone remembers the rain around Easter. So my lesson that I learned was that if you go camping and it's raining when you get your tent down, it's not good enough when you get home just to unroll the tent and wipe the outside of the tent so the outside's dry. You also have to dry the inside of the tent. You have to put it right up, dry the inside. Otherwise, the inside will go mouldy. So I learnt that by practical experience.
Oh,
that does sound more useful.
That is definitely more useful.
Ben?
Well, mine, if that was useful and Owen's was more philosophical, then mine's more esoteric, shall we suggest, favourably. Dogs drink backwards. So looking at my dog is pathetic at drinking. It's like watching, I don't even know what, but it's like the mess that occurs when the dog drinks. Obviously, it's warm weather here in the UK this week, so the dog's drinking quite a lot. And it was only recently that I learned that when the dog sticks its tongue in, I kind of had the impression that what it was doing was kind of lapping water up. So it's kind of almost making a bit of a bowl shape with its tongue and then sort of putting it back in its mouth. But it's actually more like an elephant's trunk. So the tongue's going in and then scooping backwards and lobbing the water back at its throat from underneath it, which is why my dog is just so pathetic at drinking. Because, I mean, who could do that? Who would suggest that, like, imagine next time you're thirsty, go up to a jug of water and just put your hand in backwards and just lob it at your face and see how much you get out of that.
I think cats have a weird way of drinking as well. They do something like, I think they projectile their tongue in, and then when they pull it back out, it does some sort of, it pulls the water towards them, so they're not actually lapping. It's almost like it creates a projectile back into their mouth. It's
like all of these animals have adopted SCORM as their drinking standard. They've never really evolved. Like, they've become more sophisticated, but like they could have gone for the xAPI, like get a glass. It would have been so much easier.
You can tell that Ross is a cat person because you've told a story about dogs there, Ben, and Ross has gone straight to but cats.
The superior.
Yeah, it's like when people talk about their babies. It's so annoying. All right, I'm going to finish up with this week. I was chatting to a loyal listener from China. It started out as a Twitter conversation that, Owen, you were involved in. We were talking about L&D in China, and then that moved on to the merits of WeChat, the big messaging platform, huge in China. It's kind of their kind of WhatsApp, Facebook equivalent. And then I logged on to WeChat and became friends with this person because I wanted to see how it worked. And we formed sort of a pen pal relationship over the course of a week or two. And then I got a voice message from him on WeChat picking up on my use of the phrase effity jeffity and asking me if I was a fan of Wittertainment. So I confess here that I am, and if there's any other Wittertainees out there, you're not alone. Please do say hello to Jeremy Irons. And that's it. That's all from us. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on the show, you can tweet me at Ross Garner GP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
You can tweet Andrew
at Mr. Downs.
And you can tweet Ben
at bbets.
For more from Good Practice, please visit goodpractice.com or tweet at Good Practice and at GoodPracticeAUS. If you've enjoyed this show, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget that 2 weeks ago we produced a video special filmed in the pub, which you can now watch on YouTube. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, along with links to all of the other resources and websites that we've mentioned today. Next week, why we need to stop overcomplicating learning. A subtle antidote to today's chat, perhaps. We'll see how that goes. Until then, bye for now.